express our appreciation for them joining us in worship today. And Patrick's not back in here, but I made a comment last week about needing to wear a tinfoil hat because it seemed like he could read my mind each week when he does his sermon before I do my study this morning. Well, he did it to me again. And in particular, where he mentioned what Christ said when he answered the question, what is the greatest commandment? And of course, it's to worship God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And the second one was like it, to love our brother and our neighbor. Well, this study that we're having on our form of government and our Constitution and how it relates to us as Christians and how we should relate to it, our founders also held that principle. And their understanding of liberty was along the same lines. In order to love your neighbor and your brother, you had to respect the rights that God gave them as well. And that your rights and liberties should not supersede their rights and liberties. And that is exactly how our founders also formed our form of government and our Constitution. There is no other government that I know of on earth that so strongly mimics and patterned a form of government in a way that mimics Christ's commandments to us as Christians, how we should treat each other. There was lots of things happened this week that comes to mind of, what is going right and what is going wrong today with our government. And how will that influence us as Christians to be able to continue with the relative freedoms that we have to be able to gather like this to worship or to stand on the street corner and tell other people about Christ. Well, several things happened this week that I just want to briefly mention. One of them directly relating to Christianity in the world. In China, I guess over the last 10 to 20 years, China has been one of the areas in the world where Christianity has grown by leaps and bounds. Well, I have a copy of a brief comment that was on the internet about what's going on now in China. It's as if they're trying to reverse course. It said Western forces are trying to use, this was written by what a Chinese official had said, that Christianity is trying to subvert the Chinese government and country. It said Western forces are trying to use Christianity to influence China's society and even subvert the government, a senior official said, warning that Chinese Christians needed to follow a Chinese model of the religion. China's constitution guarantees religious freedom, but since President Xi Jinping took office 6 years ago, the government has tightened restrictions on religions seen as a challenge to the authority of the ruling Communist Party. The government has cracked down on underground churches, both Protestant and Catholic, even as it seeks to improve relations with the Vatican. Now, those that's been listening to this class for quite a while, where we went over the history, in particular British history, of how we got our Constitution. Several of those comments should have rang a bell to you, where China's wanting to dictate, well, this form of Christianity is okay, but this form is not. We have to give our government approval to what type of Christianity we're going to allow you to worship. And also, the government seeing Christianity as a form of trying to subvert the powers of the government. Christianity, biblically speaking, never went to subvert any form of government, only to hold it accountable to God's law and to try and form that government or keep its reins on the government in order to allow for the government not to suppress the Christian religion within that country. So we know history for a very long time has followed this pattern. We give you religious freedom as long as it's the kind I approve of. And that's part of the purpose of this class that we've been doing, trying to help us become more aware of that type of thing going on, to even be able to recognize it, and to also gain an understanding of how we as Christians can help influence and reform or form, or to use a biblical principle to restore our form of government to a way that allows Christianity to once again be observed in this country as our founders intended. Now, again, I mentioned we started as a British colony, so British history is our history. But I also noted another event this past week that happened in Great Britain, where Great Britain also has a constitution, and as we've learned through the history we've gone through, they also have their recognition of the right to free speech, the right to worship as you see fit. Well, this past week, there was a British journalist that was arrested for a tweet. And in that tweet, that British journalist failed to properly recognize the assumed gender of a particular individual. Not of a child, but an adult person. Well, the parent of that adult person, when they read that tweet, filed a complaint with the government. And now the government has investigated and arrested that journalist for breaching one of their new laws on where it's hate speech to not properly recognize someone's assumed identity or gender. And don't think that won't happen here, or has it? Because remember, much of what we formed our Constitution and our laws on, while it was biblically principled, it was also British history. So a lot of what you see in Europe, and in particular Great Britain, it may take a 10-year cycle, but it often shows up here in America the same way. There was also one other event that I'll touch on, and then I'll get back into our lesson, and so that I don't misquote something. And I know this has been pretty popular this week on Facebook and other social media for people talking about it. Most of them are talking about it in a positive way, but don't know how many people noticed. But this past week, the Missouri Senate voted to nullify all federal gun laws within the state. It was voted on 23-10. Now, while that sounds good and may encourage people, there's two problems with it. First, this is the second state to do so in recent history. The first state was Kansas. Kansas passed a similar law that also made it unlawful for a federal agent to try and enforce federal gun laws in the state to the point where they could be arrested. Well, it's fine and dandy to pass a bill, but it's another thing to have those representatives that you were duly elected that passed that bill to stand behind it once they've done so. Well, in Kansas, there was 2 individuals who were proud service members, served their country well, 100% followed the state law, and an owner of a store sold a suppressor to another individual, again, following state law 100%. Well, when the feds came in there and found out about it, had them both arrested. Neither the governor, or the attorney general, or any of the representatives that passed that law stood up for those 2 individuals. So while the notion here that Missouri is trying to do is all fine and dandy, on one hand, where they're trying to take back the unalienable rights of us, the people, it'll have to be wait and see when the rubber hits the road, because we know who pays the piper dictates the tune. Well, the first thing that we'll see is the federal government say, well, fine, if you're going to do that, then we're going to withhold federal money from you. Oh, wait, we didn't mean that. No, we'll change our tune. But the main reason I wanted to bring that up is to make this point. Why would a state have to make and pass a law that recognizes something that is already recognized by every state constitution in the Union and the United States Constitution? To use an analogy, I would say, we understand there's nothing in the Bible that says for us Christians to worship and have music in our worship, you must sing. There's no commandment to do that. What we have are biblical examples to sing. It said it doesn't have a you will sing or you will not use an instrument of music. That doesn't exist for us in the New Testament. It's just a biblical principle and the example to sing. That is one example of the liberty we have through Christ. Christ doesn't have to go and say, you must do this, you must do that. You can't do this and you can't do that, like they did under the Mosaic law. But he established certain principles, and by their examples, we know that we're to sing as Christians in worship to God. Well,
just to clarify, we are in fact commanded to sing. So that would necessarily exclude, unless there's some precedent or example to say otherwise. That's what he expects us to do.
Exactly, and that's the precedent I'm trying to point out. It would not be right then for us to say, well, as a church, then we need to make a resolution or establish a church doctrine that says we have to sing. Because it's unnecessary. It's understood that that's what God intends for us to do. Because to do so would then to say, well, we have to acknowledge then on a piece of paper that that's what God meant, without the understanding from this piece of paper that that's what God means. Well, in that particular instance, when the state of Missouri writes a law for something that is already lawful, all they're doing is they're giving the other side the argument, well, if we don't put it down on paper, then it's not valid or not lawful, not legal, even though it already is. It lends them more credence, because once you've given a government the perceived authority to write that kind of a law, then what's the next step? Well, we've given you that law, so if we want to, we'll take it back.
Yeah, I like what you're trying to do in this class, because it sheds the spotlight on the real issue. And the real issue is people have lost an understanding of what the Constitution is and how it binds us together and yet keeps us separate in a way. We forget the spirit of the Constitution. We saw a news commentator lose her job this last week because she simply pointed out that an elected representative from a Muslim district who claims she can follow Sharia law and still uphold the Constitution. I said, that's not possible. You can't have both. You've got to choose one or the other. She lost her job over that. That's tragic that kind of thing would happen. But it illustrates just how far removed from our understanding overall is it. And they got by with it, and then probably other agencies and organizations get by with similar things because it's politically correct, or we don't want to offend anybody, we don't want to make Muslims upset, they might cut our heads off. So let's just keep that quiet because if Sharia law and the Constitution are compatible, that's absurd on its face. But that's just how far we've come. We need, as a general rule, to understand, well, are we going to continue to live by the freedoms that God gave us, granted us, that have been allowed us because of His providence and because of the blood and sacrifice of many that have gone before us? Or are we going to just sit back and say, well, we don't want to make waves, we don't want to say anything, besides it's boring, talk about history and learn about the Constitution. I mean, at some point, we got to say, we got to sacrifice one or the other, And it's time people started waking up to what's happening. I mean, we're in a very precarious situation right now. And it's because of ignorance. We just don't know.
It is. You get a tweet like what that British journalist tweeted out, and you'll get set off a firestorm over social media and have ramifications and serious consequences. Yet I know some of you've heard, but how many of you realize how many Christians were murdered the last 2 weeks in Nigeria?
There were 4 beheaded children in Iraq by ISIS that's now moving into Iraq. Children, because they would not convert to Islam, so they cut their heads off, literally. This past week, but no one's talking about that. We're not hearing about it.
That'll never happen here, right?
We have a representative already advocating such behavior here. And we have a news outlet that's supporting her right to do that. And you can't speak against her, because if you do, well, you're going to have serious price to pay for it. Yeah, we're in a very bad situation right now. No one seems to understand it.
We seem to be asleep at the wheel and definitely ignoring the second great commandment. I can remember 30, 40 years ago, people talking about gun control, for instance, or even abortion. That'll never become widespread in this country. Ever. If we only had a time machine. Now,
when the towers came down, we, as a nation, rose up and said, we will never forget. Now we're electing individuals to our House of Representatives who are Muslim and who openly speak of hurting and destroying our ally, Israel, in the Middle East, and speak openly against our Constitution. But you can't say that, because you might lose your job if you say it, because we don't want to offend anybody. But that's already happening. We've forgotten. We don't, as a nation, we don't remember.
Well, like I said, we tend to, in America, follow about 10 years after what goes on in Europe. Well, now in America, something that never could have been imagined is law. And again, those who've been in here knows that just because it's a law doesn't necessarily make it lawful. But we now have law that it is permissible to murder a baby even after delivery.
Yes.
So to say that something won't ever happen in America because you can't conceive it now is not plausible anymore. It's not a valid argument anymore. We're sitting here talking today in this building and can worship God the way we see fit. We'll always be able to do that in America, right? But I like to use an analogy of our church history as well. You know, when the church was established, we had the perfect example. We had God-inspired men giving us the message and setting the example where they set up churches all across Asia. Those churches had the perfect example to follow. We know the authority of the example that they had, because that example and that authority was God himself. Yet how long did it take before Christianity became changed? It didn't take long at all. We as humans are very fickle and easy to sway from one side to the other based on how we choose to live. Do we live on principles, or do we live on what does good for me, what I feel at the moment?
And Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2, while he was alive and still writing epistles, the spirit of lawlessness is already at work. I mean, even in his lifetime, the seed was being sown, change and alter the church government.
Absolutely. Well, while I mentioned our Constitution and our form of government is not inspired of God, just as our church is, we were given it through God's providence and blessing to have the only form of government, especially at that time, that would even lead to the ability for us to be able to gather like this without hindrance from government. But it also did not take long for us as a nation to go astray from the original pattern. Yes, sir?
I know these things seem terrible to us, and they seem terrible to me, some of the things you've mentioned. But we have to remember God's in control.
Amen. Every
time, God is in control. No matter what happens here, in our short, brief, little, tiny time on earth. It may end tomorrow, may go on for another 1,000 years, but God is in control.
Absolutely. God uses evil governments for what? To punish the evil. We live amongst plenty of evil, even here in the United States. And that being true, it's also true. What happened to Nineveh?
Forgave them.
Nineveh was not even recognized as a nation of God-fearing people. But God knew something about them. He knew the first time that if he sent a preacher, that they would repent of the evil that they did. Now, they were an evil nation. They deserved the punishment that God was going to send to them. But if they would repent of their sin, then God gave them reprieve, right? The first time? Well, just like us, we live in a society surrounded by evil.
Yeah.
But we have equal rights and sovereignty as individuals to also take a stand for our beliefs and to influence the governments over us for good or for evil. So if we as Nineveh repent and become active as Christians, citizens in this country, we can actually influence our society and our government for good, with the hopes that God would repent and not send the doom that we obviously are traveling towards in seems like a rushing pace. Or we as citizens can hide within our four walls and worship God on Sunday and Wednesdays and let the outside world take care of itself and then be suffering under those consequences. Or we can become active citizens as Christians to help to influence and reform, or I would say restore, our government back to the way that it should be, where liberty is protected and not corporate or personal privileges and corruption is protected. Yes, sir.
I hate to keep interrupting, but this whole lesson is in this series. It reminded me of when I was a little boy. I remember when I was first aware, as a young man, a little boy, of public prayers at a church service. One of the things that was very, very, very common in those days, particularly among the older men, was to thank God that we were allowed to assemble free from molestation. And I remember thinking, what does that mean? What are they talking about? And why are they so interested in assembling here we've never had any problem here before. These are men that came back from World War II and all over Europe and Asia, some of them from Korea, and there were some from Vietnam, but even if they hadn't been there themselves, they were from that generation. And they knew, they understood because they saw it firsthand. And they could see the contrast with the freedom that we have here. And they knew just how fragile that freedom is and how precarious the situation we find ourselves. And so they were right to thank God. And we should be more mindful. I think that's what Paul had in mind when he told Timothy to pray for those in authority, that we might lead a quiet and peaceable life, that the gospel might go forth without hindrance. And if we just sit back complacently and say, well, God will take care of everything. Well, yeah, he will, but we have to do our part too. And part of that is being aware and being educated and understanding, what's happening in our world. Now, regarding how much we should get involved, that's another topic of discussion. But I think it's grand that at least we're having it brought to our attention. That there are things that we really should not take for granted. And one of them is the right to do, like you said, what we're doing right now. And we should thank God that we have the right. The people all over the world can't do this. And like I said, it's just very disturbing to see images, as I did this morning, of children kneel down in front of a man about to cut their head off. And young people, because they wouldn't convert to Islam. And to think that's not going to happen here. I don't want that to happen anywhere. But it's going to continue to happen if we don't understand how to deal with it. Of course, the biggest answer to that is to preach the gospel. To whisper hope, as our brother suggested this morning. We need to do more whispering on a loud rooftop if we can. But we need to let the world know that there's a better way, and it's God's way.
Absolutely. I know our founders greatly relied on God and their faith in God. And the difference between our fight for liberty and the later fight that occurred in France for liberty was, in France, they were not so focused on God and the rights coming from God. They were more of what you would see today in the, what were they called? There was the Antifa, where they just want what we want. We want to be free to do whatever. Rather than God's second commandment, to love your brother and your neighbor, where you care about somebody else's liberty, not just what you want, to get free to do whatever you want. Bob?
Well, what Patrick was saying, people should be thankful for this opportunity. And can it happen in America? Just a few short years ago, my other son and I were in Cuba, which forbidden that more than 10 persons meet in anyone's house at one time. We had an engagement to study the Bible with a lady in her home, and when we got there, about 40 to 50 people showed up, some inside the house and some outside, and I preached almost like Paul did till midnight, and so Philip translated for me, and a number of persons said they wanted to obey the gospel, be baptized the next day. Early the next morning, we drove over there to that house, and the lady came running out, stopped us from getting out of the car. Says, please don't get out and come in. I was almost arrested last night, and if you get out and come in my house, I will be arrested for allowing you to be here last night. And then looked behind us, and there's a patrol car right on our bumper, and wherever we went, it went with us. Mm-hmm. So our freedom is 90 miles off our shore, that close, and when socialism takes root, that's what will happen.
Well, just like in my very first lesson I did, our rights don't have to be taken away from us at gunpoint. All we have to do is be convinced to give them up for the promise of something else. Prosperity, a promise of security. Because I guarantee you, if you knew a fraction of the laws that would be introduced, and I'm not just talking about at the federal level, I'm talking about at the state level. There's so many laws that are being introduced that you can't keep up with all of them. And they'll put names on them, like for somebody that was killed. And when they start naming laws after somebody that's lost their life, you better read it closely. Because they're going to use that to slip in something. Or they'll bundle. They like to bundle a lot of laws together. You may have a religious freedom law. It's not really a religious freedom law, but in addition, they may have something in there that has nothing to do with religious freedom, but it's going to take another liberty away from you. This is not how our country was founded and intended to operate.
Well, something happened in Georgia this week. The Georgia Senate voted on a heartbeat law, which a lot of people have been fighting for years to see enacted. And it passed the Senate, making it illegal in Georgia to abort a baby if the doctor can detect a heartbeat. Anything after that, considered murder. And you say, well, that's a victory, and it is a victory in light of the context in which we're operating. But you go back to the point you're making. We already have that guaranteed. I mean, we already know that we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's part of who we are as a nation. But it's tragic that we have to pass laws to protect those very liberties that are already ours. I mean, I'm proud for the right to life people, but I'm saddened that it's come to this. But it's also good to know that New York now has infanticide laws, and we have heartbeat laws. So we're right back where we were in the 1860s, but, different issue, different time, but still, we're still a divided nation, very much.
Yeah, but the problem with that now, though, is now you've got government saying it both ways, which means now it's arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So whoever's in power at the time will choose what is right and what's wrong, what's legal and not.
Oh, eventually go to the Supreme Court, and there we will learn what is supposed to be, and that's what we're going to learn.
Yeah, well,
That's
James Madison, I'm not quoting him directly, but in essence, it's liberty should know no bounds except that it should not limit someone else's liberty. He was speaking in particularly of the right to free speech. But that principle could be applied to each and every inalienable right that we have. And not to mention that not all inalienable rights are mentioned on paper either. Because if you notice when we went through the Declaration of Independence, it didn't list what all of our unalienable rights are. They said, among these are these examples. Because our unalienable rights are innumerable, and they come from God, and they're not limited. And then, because if they understood, if they'd have limited them to a list, that was part of the great debate and argument about the Bill of Rights being added to the Constitution before it would be ratified. They understood that once you make a list, the government's going to say, okay, everything not on that list must be our prerogative, when it's not. The same with these laws, though. Now that they've been made a law, now the government can say, well, see, this falls under our prerogative. You've given us that power, when they didn't have it to begin with.
Of course, we could take heart in the fact that we're seeing through legal channels the unraveling of a legal travesty in 1973, where the Supreme Court literally out of thin air decided to grant the right, quote unquote, of a woman to abort, murder her baby. We're just seeing bit by bit that being responded to. But again, it should never have happened in 1973, and it shouldn't be necessary now.
Well,
we are where we are.
I'm not ever going to get to my lesson. To bring up that point, the Supreme Court ruled, well, the Supreme Court is not kings and queens. We treat them as such, as an oligarchy.
Exactly.
But the only power that has been delegated to them, and remember, the judicial branch is the weakest branch of government. We don't have three co-equal branches of government. That is another misconception that's taught over and over, because they know if you tell a lie long enough and often enough, people believe it. The only co-equal powers that the three branches have is the power to check the other branches. If they were co-equal, then why would they be different? Why would the Constitution delegate these powers to the executive branch, these powers to the legislative branch, and these powers to the judicial branch? If they're all co-equal, then why separate them? Because they're not. The only co-equal part of them is in each branch's ability, and not in the same way, because each branch has its particular constitutional methods of how to check the powers of the other branches. So the judicial branch being the weakest, because our founders understood how easy it is to corrupt the court system and to control the people once you've done that. Because if the judicial branch was the most powerful, then all you have to do is get one corrupt judge to make one corrupt ruling. And now what's the word that's always used to justify new rulings? Precedent. So you get one corrupt judge to set a precedent, and the others say, well, we're sorry. It may be unconstitutional or against the Constitution, but now we have a precedent that our hands are tied. We have to follow it. That's not how it's supposed to work. That's how we've allowed it to work. But that ruling on Roe v. Wade, now you got me saying it, their opinion on Roe v. Wade, a court only has the authority to issue an opinion on the case being held in front of it at that time. So their opinion's only bound on the two groups that are in that court case. So Roe v. Wade did not set the precedent in this country that made abortion legal. What made abortion legal in this country was everybody being told, well, the Supreme Court says it, so now it's the law of the land. But that's not how it works, constitutionally speaking. That opinion of Roe v. Wade was only legally binding on each side in that particular court case. That does not set that as a law for the whole rest of the country. But we've been told that and taught that. So now we believe that, to the point to where our state legislatures now feel the need to write a law to protect the heartbeat. But it's a frivolous law. It's unnecessary because that protection already exists, but we don't recognize it. We've done the same in the world as Christianity speaking. We have more denominations than you can count. All of them either being started with good intentions of trying to correct a doctrinal issue that they saw. Some of them were started out of outright rejection of God's word. Well, we're going to want it the way we want it. But most of them were not. They recognized the Christian pattern that was being followed, say, the Church of England or the Catholic Church. Well, that's not scriptural. So we're going to reform those. Well, finally somebody got the bright idea. Why are we keeping on reforming things? Why don't we just restore the original pattern? And that's what I'm trying to bring out in this class. We don't need to reform our government by writing new laws that recognize a heartbeat. We need to restore our principles that recognize that anyway. But we don't need laws to do that. We just need representatives and judges and county commissioners, prosecutors, defendants that recognize our principles of liberty that we were founded on. That is what governments were instituted for, was to protect our liberties. And until we can get to the point to where they can't even recognize liberty anymore, much less defend it. That's what we've got to do. That's while we're out spreading the gospel. You're going to have to use the same pattern for restoring knowledge of how we as a liberty-minded country, society should operate. I'm not even going to get started. Next week I'll pick up back where we were discussing some points out of George Washington's farewell address. But quickly, while I got time, I can do this brief thing. I've got 6 little-known facts about the Bill of Rights. It says here are 6 little-known facts about the Bill of Rights to help you defend liberty. Number 1, the Bill of Rights is not an afterthought of the founders to correct the Constitution. It was actually a negotiated condition for ratifying the Constitution. The delegates of the 5 states were refusing to ratify the Constitution. Virginia was one of those states, and the Virginia delegates agreed to ratify the Constitution only if there would be a guarantee of debate on provisions to add a Bill of Rights. So on March 7th, 1788, the Virginia Baptist General Committee discussed the Constitution. There's another point I want to bring out. When coming up to the lead up of our revolution, our discussing as a nation of standing up for our rights from our government overseas, not recognizing and representing us, those occurred in the churches here. It was the churches in this nation that helped to start our liberty movement. Just a little piece of trivia. So in that, they said, whether the new federal constitution, which had now lately made its appearance in public, made sufficient provision for the secure enjoyment of religious liberty, on which it was agreed unanimously that, in the opinion of the General Committee, it did not. So without Virginia's consent, there would be no union, no constitution, no federal government, and in order to form the union, the other 8 states agreed to adding the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was not established to control the federal government. It was written to remind the people to never let the government control their inherent rights. Well, I'm out of time.
They feared something?
Sir?
You think they feared something?
They knew their history. Like I said, the famous quote is, if you do not know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And the improvised version says you're doomed to repeat its mistakes, not just repeat history. So we want to educate ourselves enough to where we don't repeat those same mistakes. Thank you for your attention.